Solitude is not simply the absence of people. It is the presence of your true self. A chosen man begins to understand this the moment he recognizes that the world around him has shaped his identity more than his own inner voice ever has. Being alone becomes less of a punishment and more of a quiet return to who he was meant to be. When the noise of the world drifts away, something unexpected happens. Clarity appears. Thoughts that were once tangled in expectations slowly unravel, revealing what you truly want and who you truly are. Most people never reach this point because they never allow themselves to sit in silence long enough to hear anything meaningful. But the chosen man learns that solitude is a forge, and he steps into it willingly. In this solitude, he begins to shed the layers of identity that were created for him, labels given by family, judgments from society, and roles he played to fit in. These layers fall away one by one, sometimes gently, sometimes painfully. The world has taught him to constantly perform, but solitude teaches him to simply exist. At first, the quiet can feel uncomfortable. It exposes insecurities, unresolved emotions, and forgotten dreams. But instead of running from these truths, he faces them. He understands that a man cannot claim strength if he has never confronted his own weaknesses. In the stillness, he starts to see patterns in his life, why he reacted the way he did, why certain relationships drained him, why certain environments never felt like home. This self-awareness becomes a powerful weapon, one that can only be forged when no one else is around to influence him. Others may view his distance as arrogance, detachment, or coldness, but he knows it is none of those things. He isn't pulling away from the world because he dislikes it. He's pulling away because he is learning to move through it with intention rather than habit. The chosen man's solitude is not about rejecting people. It's about inviting truth. It is in those moments alone that he starts building a new kind of strength, one rooted not in dominance or bravado, but in understanding and inner stability. He learns to trust his intuition more than the opinions of others. He becomes comfortable in his own presence, and that comfort becomes a foundation that no external force can shake. Over time, solitude transforms from an unfamiliar space into a sacred one, a place where growth becomes natural and clarity becomes constant. In walking alone, he is not lost. He is finally on the path that was always meant for him. As a man begins to awaken, he slowly realizes that the world he once belonged to no longer feels the same. The conversations that once entertained him begin to feel shallow. The environments that once felt exciting now feel draining. And the people he once surrounded himself with start to reveal patterns he can no longer ignore. It's not that he becomes better than others, he simply becomes different. His mind begins to stretch in directions that most around him have never explored. The more he becomes aware, the more he sees the invisible strings that guide people's thoughts, beliefs, and actions. He recognizes the routines that society repeats without question, and he wonders why so few people ever attempt to break free from them. This growing awareness naturally creates distance. It's not intentional, it's a side effect of awakening. When you begin to see life from a higher vantage point, the ground you once stood on feels foreign. The chosen man starts to crave conversations that go beyond gossip and entertainment. He seeks meaning, depth, and truth, things that the average mindset rarely prioritizes. As he evolves, he notices how many people cling to comfort zones, how many avoid self-reflection, and how many fear change more than stagnation. This realization doesn't make him judge others, but it does create a quiet separation within him. He begins to understand that not everyone is meant to walk with him into his next chapter. Some people exist only in earlier versions of his life, and as his consciousness expands, he must let those versions go. Even the people he once felt closest to may start to misunderstand him. They might say he has become distant, or that he has changed too much, but he knows that change is the essence of growth. Staying the same would be a betrayal of the truth he's discovering. Awareness becomes a responsibility once you see. You cannot pretend to be blind again. With this heightened sensitivity, he becomes more selective about the energy he allows into his space. He notices how easily the average mindset can pull him back into old habits, old fears, and old ways of thinking. So he chooses solitude not out of rejection, but out of protection of his expanding consciousness. The path he walks now requires clarity, intention, and strength, and these qualities cannot survive in environments that promote distraction and conformity. This separation, though difficult, becomes a vital part of his transformation. As he rises, he naturally steps into a new realm of understanding, one that only those who choose awareness can ever enter. In the quiet moments when the world falls away, a man meets the part of himself he has spent years avoiding. This is where the ego begins to loosen its grip. Alan Watts often spoke about the illusion of the separate self, the voice inside us that constantly seeks validation, approval, and control. In solitude, that voice becomes exposed because there is no one left to impress, nothing left to prove, and nowhere for the ego to hide. When a chosen man walks alone, he enters a space where the masks he wore for society start slipping off one by one. The ego hates this because it thrives on noise, comparison, and distraction. Silence starves it. At first, the ego fights back. It whispers doubts, reminding him of old insecurities and past mistakes. It tries to convince him that being alone is a sign of weakness or failure. But as he remains in that silence, something shifts. He starts to realize that many of his past decisions were driven not by authenticity, but by fear. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of not being enough. In solitude, he begins to see how often he acted to protect his ego, not his truth. This recognition is uncomfortable, but it is also the doorway to inner liberation. When a chosen man continues walking this path, he begins to observe his thoughts with detachment. He recognizes that not every thought is real, not every fear is true, and not every impulse is aligned with who he truly is. Without the constant influence of external opinions, he becomes the witness of his own mind. This witnessing dissolves the ego's power. The stories he once clung to, stories of needing success to matter, needing validation to feel worthy, needing attention to feel alive, start to crumble. He begins to feel lighter, freer, and more grounded in his authentic self. The dissolution of the ego creates space for something new, genuine self-understanding. He no longer measures himself through comparisons or social expectations. Instead, he looks inward for direction. This inner alignment becomes a source of strength that doesn't fluctuate with the opinions of others. In letting the ego fade, he discovers a deeper, quieter form of confidence, one not built on dominance or achievement, but on clarity and self-acceptance. Walking alone becomes transformative because it strips away everything false and leaves only what is real. The chosen man learns that solitude doesn't make him empty, it makes him whole. He emerges from this inner journey with a presence that is calm, steady, and unshakable, no longer ruled by the illusions of ego, but guided by the truth of who he really is. As a man steps further into awakening, he begins to see a truth that quietly separates him from the world. Most people fear the very things that allow him to grow. The average person clings to familiarity, even if that familiarity limits them. They hold onto routines because routines make them feel safe. They follow expectations because expectations make life predictable. But the chosen man is pulled by something deeper, an inner calling that refuses to let him settle for comfort when purpose is waiting beyond it. This difference in direction naturally creates distance between him and the crowd. When he begins to embrace uncertainty, others see recklessness. When he questions long standing beliefs, others see rebellion. When he chooses the path less traveled, others see isolation. But what they do not understand is that the chosen man is not seeking difficulty for its own sake. He is seeking transformation. He is willing to dismantle old versions of himself even when it hurts, because he knows that truth does not grow in comfort zones. Growth always demands risk, change, and a willingness to step into the unknown. The crowd often misunderstands this because they have not heard the call he hears. They are used to living within invisible boundaries, standards set by society, expectations imposed by others, and fears passed down over generations. They are comfortable in their cages because the bars are familiar. When the chosen man breaks free, they watch him with confusion, sometimes even resentment, because his courage exposes their fear. His willingness to evolve forces them to confront the parts of themselves they have ignored. This confrontation is uncomfortable, so instead of rising with him, they often pull away from him. He notices this shift. Friends who once felt close begin to question his choices. People who once admired him now view him as distant or changed. Some even try to convince him to return to the comfortable life he has outgrown, but he cannot turn back because he has seen too much. Awareness cannot be unlearned. Once he experiences the expansion of consciousness, the limitations of ordinary thinking become impossible to accept. Yet this separation does not make him bitter. In fact, it makes him compassionate. He understands that everyone awakens at their own pace, and many may never choose the path he walks. But he no longer depends on their understanding to continue. He walks forward because his evolution requires it. The crowd fears the unfamiliar, but the chosen man steps toward it, knowing that the unknown is where his greatest transformation lies. In embracing what others resist, he becomes the example of what courage and awareness truly look like. When a man begins to elevate his mind, he naturally rises above the noise that once surrounded him. It's not an act of superiority, it's an act of clarity. He starts to see life from a distance, the way someone standing on a mountain can see the entire landscape, while those in the valley can only see what's immediately in front of them. This distance does not disconnect him from life. It allows him to understand it more deeply. The chosen man learns that perspective is one of the greatest powers he can develop, and perspective can only be gained when there is enough space between himself and the chaos he used to call normal. From this higher vantage point, patterns that were once invisible become clear. He can see the cycles people live in, the habits they repeat unconsciously, the fears that keep them stagnant, and the illusions they chase. What once seemed important, status, validation, competition, now appears shallow and fleeting. He begins to understand why so many people feel stuck. They never step far enough away from their lives to see the bigger picture. Without distance, they mistake distractions for purpose and noise for truth. Solitude grants him this clarity. In being alone, he gains the ability to reflect on his life without influence, without pressure, and without the expectations of others shaping his thoughts. This reflection sharpens his intuition. He becomes better at sensing what is right for him and what is draining him. Decisions that were once confusing become obvious. The path ahead, which once seemed uncertain, begins to reveal itself. He sees where he needs to go, not because the world tells him, but because his inner compass finally has room to speak. This clarity also makes him more intentional. He no longer moves through life on autopilot. He becomes deliberate with his actions, his relationships, and his environment. He recognizes that not everything deserves his energy, and not everyone deserves access to his mind. He starts to choose quality over quantity, quality of thoughts, quality of connections, quality of experiences. This selectiveness is often misunderstood by others, but he knows it is necessary. A man cannot keep rising if he is constantly weighed down by things that no longer align with his growth. Seeing from this elevated perspective also brings peace. He no longer reacts impulsively to the world because he understands the deeper reasons behind people's behaviors and life's challenges. He becomes less affected by negativity because he sees it for what it is: fear, confusion, or projection from those who have not yet climbed their own inner mountains. With this insight, he moves through life with a calm strength. The distance he keeps is not a barrier. It is a vantage point that empowers him to navigate his journey with wisdom, patience, and unwavering purpose. As a man continues along his solitary path of awakening, something remarkable begins to happen. The very solitude that once felt heavy begins to feel sacred, and the loneliness that once felt like a burden transforms into a quiet strength. Yet what many people fail to realize is that this journey, though it begins alone, does not remain that way forever. When a man raises his consciousness, shifts his mindset, and steps into a higher version of himself, he naturally moves into a different frequency, one that only certain people can resonate with. And as he grows, the world around him starts to rearrange itself to match the energy he now carries. At first, it seems like he has lost more than he has gained. Old relationships fade, familiar places feel foreign, and things that once brought comfort no longer satisfy him. But this clearing is necessary, because empty space is what allows new connections to enter. The chosen man begins to attract people who understand him without explanation, who value depth over distraction, and who reflect the same intentional energy he has cultivated within himself. These are not people who pull him away from his path. They walk in alignment with it. What makes this stage powerful is that the chosen man becomes a source of quiet inspiration. He doesn't preach. He doesn't force. He doesn't try to convince anyone of anything. His presence alone becomes a message. People sense the difference in him, the groundedness, the clarity, the absence of ego, and they feel drawn toward it. They feel safe around him because he is no longer ruled by insecurity or the need for validation. He listens more deeply, understands more patiently, and speaks with purpose. Without trying, he becomes someone others look to for guidance. But the most profound part of this stage is the realization that the journey was never meant to end in isolation. Solitude was the preparation. It was the cleansing, the rebuilding, the awakening. Once a man has found himself, he is ready to connect in a way he never could before. He becomes capable of healthier relationships, deeper friendships, and more meaningful bonds because he is no longer operating from fear or emptiness. He connects not to fill a void, but to share from abundance. People who are drawn to him in this new chapter are not intimidated by his growth. They grow with him. They don't fear his depth, they match it, and they don't misunderstand his silence, they honor it. These are the people who walk beside him, not behind him or against him. The chosen man realizes that although he had to rise alone, he was never meant to stay alone. His transformation becomes a lighthouse, and those meant for him naturally find their way into his life, not through force, but through resonance.